Hey, how's it going? So today, I thought we could talk a little bit about poetry, and the poetry in particular of Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet. This guy, who is regarded by many as one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. And of course, well, I don't know every poet of the 20th century, and certainly, my exposure to Polish poetry is basically him. There's something to be said for that. And he lived to a ripe old age. He lived to be 93. I think he died in 2004. Born in 1911 in what is now Lithuania. It's kind of complicated whether they were Polish or Lithuanian, but it doesn't matter because it all changed very soon after because the World War I started not long after that. And he lived through two world wars by the time he was 30. So amazing. And now, what's interesting about him to me, besides being a really fine poet, is that certainly his Polish Catholic background is an undeniable part of his poetry, but he's not I would not call him a Catholic poet necessarily. He was also influenced by Swedenborg and Blake, and by his cousin, a distant cousin, Oscar Miłosz, who was in France, and for a time there, young Czesław Miłosz was in France and met with his cousin, who's really one of these great poets, kind of a symbolist poet. He of the age of Apollinaire, another great poet, and very avant-garde. And I think there's something to Czesław Miłosz's poetry that is also, at least for the time he's writing, very avant-garde. And he reminds me, not stylistically, but in his kind of poetic intuition or instincts of William Butler Yeats, who I think was also one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. If not, certainly he may be the greatest English language poet of the 20th century. And Czesław Miłosz is like that because he's got these, he's got the tradition behind him, but he's also an innovator. And he's got the Catholic thing happening, but he's also there's an esoteric stream, which is not in your face. And it's not actually, even with Yeats, it's not always in your face. Yeats, I think he turned to esoteric matters, as he said in his introduction to A Vision, as a way to find metaphors for poetry. And I think anybody who does that, you enter into the realm of the imagination. And by doing so, you access things that I think probably esotericists or occultists have pointed to in the past, or mystics of other kinds. And I wouldn't call Miłosz an esotericist or a mystic or anything, but there is that part of his poetry that comes through. Now, I'm going to read you a very early poem. In fact, in his collected poems, he only has one poem that he includes from his earliest collection, which came out in 1933. So he was 22 when it came out. The name of the poem is Artificer. Burning, he walks in the stream of flickering letters, clarinets, machines throbbing quicker than the heart, lopped off heads, silk canvases, and he stops under the sky and raises toward it his joined, clenched fists. Believers fall on their bellies. They suppose it is a monstrance that shines. But those are knuckles. Sharp knuckles shine that way, my friends. He cuts the glowing yellow buildings in two, breaks the walls into motley halves. Pensive, he looks at the honey seeping from those huge honeycombs. Throbs of pianos, children's cries, the thud of a head banging against the floor. This is the only landscape able to make him feel. He wonders at his brother's skull shaped like an egg. Every day he shoves back his black hair from his brow, Then one day he plants a big load of dynamite and is surprised that afterward everything spouts up in the explosion. Agape, he observes the clouds and what is hanging in them. Globes, penal codes, dead cats floating on their backs, locomotives. They turn in the skeins of white clouds like trash in a puddle, while below on the earth a banner, the color of a romantic rose, flutters, and a long row of military trains crawls on the weed-covered tracks. So there we go. Young Czesław Miłosz, just a kid with a dream. And I love that image where they turn in the skeins of white clouds like trash in a puddle. Boy, so there's this undertone of anger in that poem, which is quite stunning, if you ask me. Take a little drink here. Hold on a second. Let me pause this. Okay. So in one of his most anthologized poems, or the one you see read a lot, probably a couple of videos. In fact, if you want to check out some cool videos, my friend Catherine Oliver, Catherine Kathryn, she has maybe a link in here. She does some beautiful videos. She's an artist. She does really imaginative videos. And I think she did one for this. She did one for another Czesław Miłosz poem. I think she did one for this, but maybe she didn't. But anyway, somebody should. But I'll link Catherine's website there because she's phenomenal. And she's done artwork for me before. I just love her to death. But anyway, I'm going to read this poem by Miłosz, A Song on the End of the World. And he wrote this in 1944, so he was 31. Or 33, sorry. A Song on the End of the World. On the day the world ends, a bee circles a clover. A fisherman mends a glimmering net. Happy porpoises jump in the sea. By the rainspout young sparrows are playing. And the snake is gold-skinned, as it should always be. On the day the world ends, women walk through the fields under their umbrellas. A drunkard grows sleepy at the edge of a lawn. Vegetable peddlers shout in the street, and a yellow-sailed boat comes nearer the island. The voice of a violin lasts in the air and leads into a starry night. And those who expected lightning and thunder are disappointed. And those who expected signs and archangels' trumps do not believe it is happening now. As long as the sun and the moon are above, as long as the bumblebee visits a rose, as long as rosy infants are born, no one believes it is happening now. Only a white-haired old man who would be a prophet, yet he is not a prophet, for he is much too busy, repeats while he binds his tomatoes. There will be no other end of the world. There will be no other end of the world. It's a fine poem. Now, when I would teach creative writing, and even now when I work with young poets, a lot of young poets think poems are made of ideas, and they're not. They're made of images. And Miłosz is a master of the image, and they're just simple images, right? And the thing is, what happens is you watch as these images he builds up these images, and he doesn't explain them. That's another problem young poets have. They feel like it's like Aesop's fables, the moral of the story, and that's not how it goes. But he just is simple. A bee circles a clover. A fisherman mends a glimmering net. I mean, economy, but those pictures you don't have to work too hard to conjure up those images in your imagination. Happy porpoises jump in the sea, right? And it's just beautiful. I mean, it's beautiful, but also so much is conveyed by the images that if you try to explain it in words, even though the images are built in words, if you try to explain it, you kill it, right? And that's the magic of poetry, is it work, as Shakespeare says in Henry V. work on your imagination. Let us ciphers do this compt on your imagination's work. Right? So he's working on your imagination, and he's evoking the exact feeling he's feeling, I think, that he wants to translate to you about this song for the end of the world. And I don't even want to explain what it means other than to let it be. But I do, I mean, just the way it works, for me as a poet, it's one of the things that interests me is how does it work, And it works through these beautiful images. It's well, not just beautiful. He'd even, in the earlier poem, he had some, you could say, ugly images, right? Or tragic images, or not nice images. But he throws these images in there. I mean, look at this. As long as the sun and the moon are above, as long as the bumblebee visits a rose, as long as rosy infants are born, no one believes it is happening now. And of course, he uses repetition. Masterful piece of work there. All right. Now, he's kind of, like I said, he's an avant-garde poet. And it's interesting, usually I would not undertake to talk about poems in translation, but luckily for us, Miłosz translated his own poems, or at least he knew who the translators were, and he knew in English well enough to say whether he liked it or not, and sometimes he would change his mind. Robert Haas, I think, helped with a lot of these. And with Miłosz, now it's interesting, he lived in the United States, from the 1950s, I think, because he had been a Polish diplomat even during the communist regime of Poland, but he defected eventually, and then he got his wife and his child out. But it was hard for him to get into the United States. He was considered a communist or some communist sympathizer. He wasn't. And he finally did get into the United States. What brought him to people's attention, though, was not his poetry, at least in the West. I just dropped something. It's this book right here, The Captive Mind. Brought him to a lot of people's attention. Because this is a book he wrote about how people he knew in Poland, little by little, compromised their integrity and principles to make it okay for them to go along with the communist regime, right? And it's brilliant analysis of how people talk themselves into bullshit, right? And I think when I first read it, maybe 10 years ago, it's probably one of the more important books of the 20th century. It's up there with Brave New World and 1984, and maybe. What's the book by Hannah Arendt, about how people compromise, right? I can't remember the name of the book right now, but I think it's just brilliant. And he was in the middle of it, and that's when he moved to the United States, and he had the peace movement here in the 60s, and he just thought it was bullshit. Here's all these kids, we're gonna have peace and love, and he's like, yeah, tell me how peace and love is gonna help you when they, somebody lines you up against a wall and and shoots you in the head. So, and he had a real problem with Allen Ginsberg, as do I. Because he went through it, Here's one thing for an American spoiled brat intellectual to complain about the man, right? The kind of luxury of complaining, compared to a guy who lived through it. Actually, he lived outside of Warsaw when Warsaw was leveled. Okay, so don't give him a speech about the man. He lived through it, but he's got some of his poems are certainly political, but most of what his poems are about, though, I think, is about transcendence and about what makes us human, right? What makes life worth living. Like poetry, makes life worth living, and that's where you see the influence of Blake and Swedenborg in his poem, and I think even the Catholic tradition. There is a transcendence that permeates his poetry, like we saw in A Song for the End of the World. There's a transcendence even there. So let's read this one. It's essa, which is Latin for to be. And this, he doesn't have a lot of them, but this is a prose poem, which is kind of written in paragraph form or block form. And I love it. Written in 1954, so he was about 43 when he wrote this one. I looked at that face, dumbfounded. The lights of metro stations flew by. I didn't notice them. What can be done if our sight lacks absolute power to devour objects ecstatically in an instant, leaving nothing more than the void of an ideal form, a sign like a hieroglyph, simplified from the drawing of an animal or bird? A slightly snubbed nose, a high brow with sleekly brushed back hair, the line of the chin. But why isn't the power of sight absolute? And in a whiteness tinged with pink, 2 sculpted holes containing a dark, lustrous lava. To absorb that face, but to have it simultaneously against the background of all spring boughs, walls, waves, in its weeping, its laughter, moving it back 15 years or ahead 30. To have. It is not even a desire. Like a butterfly, a fish, the stem of a plant, only more mysterious. And so it befell me that after so many attempts at naming the world, I am able only to repeat, harping on one string, the highest, the unique avowal beyond which no power can attain. I am. She is. Shout. Blow the trumpets, make 1,000 strong marches, leap, rend your clothing, repeating only is. She got out at Raspail. I was left behind with the immensity of existing things. A sponge, suffering because it cannot saturate itself. A river, suffering because reflections of clouds and trees are not clouds and trees. I mean, it's a talk. So this is kind of a human experience, right? Where, I mean, he's 43. He sees a beautiful girl on the subway, and but it's not just a beautiful girl. It's erotic, but it's kind of the Augustinian eros, right? Where God calls us to the thing, right, to the things of this world, where the transcendent reveals itself through this woman, and it's not an abstraction from her, and it has everything to do with her, but he doesn't even know her. In fact, I saw an interview with him one time. He's talking about this poem. He said it is a transaction that takes maybe 5 minutes, right, and it's over. But you had this revelation, and I love it. I mean, I especially that last line. A river suffering because reflections of clouds and trees are not clouds and trees, right? I mean, that erotic longing. That goes back to Plato, right? Where beauty is God's secret substance in the world that leads us to transcendence, to truth, to beauty and goodness, right? And I think this poem is just brilliant at a way it evokes that. And again, talking about those images, it's all he's just doing is just listing images that evoke emotions in us, right? And so this absolute appreciation, and also the commentary that he throws in as well. A slightly snubbed nose, a high brow with sleekly brushed back hair, the line of the chin. Why isn't the power of sight absolute? And in a whiteness tinged with pink, 2 sculpted holes containing a dark, lustrous lava. To absorb that face, but to have it simultaneously against the background of all spring boughs, walls, waves, and its weeping, its laughter, moving it back 15 years or ahead 30, to have. It's not even a desire. Oh, it's still so beautiful, man. This guy's got it happening right there, people. Let me see, what do we got? I got 2 more I want to read to you. Good. Now, and I know for sure Catherine's got a video of this one, which I do adore. I used to show it to students when I was teaching. It's his poem On Angels. And it's one of my favorite poems ever. I come back to this one a lot. You can tell my book is kind of cracked right here at the page for On Angels, because I used to copy this one to give it to students when I was teaching poetry or creative writing or whatever. But I'll read it. On Angels. All was taken away from you. White dresses, wings, even existence. Yet I believe you, messengers. There where the world is turned inside out, a heavy fabric embroidered with stars and beasts, you stroll, inspecting the trustworthy seams. Short is your stay here. Now and then at a matinal hour, the sky is clear, in a melody repeated by a bird, or in the smell of apples at the close of day, when the light makes the orchards magic. They say somebody has invented you, but to me this does not sound convincing, for humans invented themselves as well. The voice, no doubt it is valid proof, as it can only belong only to radiant creatures, weightless and winged, after all why not, girdled with lightning. I have heard that voice many a time when asleep, and what is strange, I understood more or less an order or an appeal in an unearthly tongue. Day draws near. Another one. Do what you can. I think we all get that message. Day draws near. Another one. Do what you can. And so, of course, he's comparing us to Jacob wrestling with the angel, right? I must go, for the day breaketh, right? And again, look what he does. I mean, just very simple. Throws these images out there, right? When he says, now and then on a matinal hour, if the sky is clear, and a melody repeated by a bird, or in the smell of apples, and this is the kicker, right? Or in the smell of apples at the close of day, when the light makes the orchards magic. Very simply described, but packed full of transcendent meaning. Yeah, pretty good. And that one he wrote in 1969 when I was a wee lad, and he was 58. So he actually, Czesław Miłosz is the generation of my grandparents. So and that's an interesting, I mean, if the era in which he was coming out of, right, with the French symbolists and his cousin Oscar Miłosz. And maybe I'll do one of these on Guillaume Apollinaire, who I think is another one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, and I love him dearly. But the thing is, he wasn't involved with translating his own poems, so I'm kind of at the mercy of I mean, I can read French, but I won't speak French because you'll laugh at me, especially native speakers. And I want to end with his poem, which he wrote at the age of 74 in 1985. And this guy, he was writing poems until he died at 93. In fact, in the introduction to this book, I just got to read a little bit of it. He says, where'd I go? Introduction is usually in the beginning. There it is. He says right here, the first paragraph in his introduction, a poet at 90 should be wise enough not to write introductions to his work of many decades. Yet my publisher insists, and my resistance to his entreaties is not dogmatic. Therefore, a few words on my poems looked at retrospectively. Right? And he wrote it at 90, and he was writing poems until he died. I think because this one, came out in 2001. He died 3 years later, and he was writing poems. I mean, died in the saddle. that's the way to go. And it's interesting when he did win the Nobel Prize for Literature, and when he did, even some of his colleagues, I think he taught at University of California, they didn't know that he was a poet. They gave him a job. He didn't have a PhD. Yeah, go team. That he was professor of Slavic languages. He knew many languages, and he taught Slavic or Eastern literature. Dostoevsky, I think he taught as well. He also wrote an introduction to a book I can't find, which is War, Three Conversations by Vladimir Soloviev. He wrote the introduction to that, which is really quite remarkable. And he wrote the introduction to this collected edition of his cousin's poems, which is very. He's a great writer. He wrote a book on Blake, he wrote a lot on Blake. His book, The Land of Ulro, I think it's called. So he's a really phenomenal writer in prose or poetry, but his poetry, that's what he'll be remembered for. And so we'll end with In a Jar, which I can relate to this one when I first read this long ago. As a kid who grew up near a floodplain in Detroit where my friends and I would go and catch salamanders and frogs and stuff. And he grew up in the countryside in Poland, or in Lithuania, I should say. And this is, and he wrote this at 74, so it's kind of retrospective in a way, looking back at one's life and the kind of the meaningful things we did that we didn't take seriously. You know, that when you're doing it at the time, you don't realize it has transcendent import, like catching in this poem, it's catching newts. But it does have transcendent import because, in a way, you could say all things are revelations to us. So here goes, In a Jar. Now with all my knowledge, honorable newts, I approach the jar in which you live, and see how you float up vertically to the surface, showing your bellies of vermilion color of flame, that makes you akin to the alchemist's salamander living in fire. Perhaps that's the reason why I caught you in a pond between pines when white April clouds race, and carried you to town, proud of my trophy. You vanished so long ago. I ponder the moment when you lived unaware of hours and years. I address you. I give you existence. Even a name and a title in the princedom of grammar, to protect you by inflection from nothingness. Myself, no doubt, held by powers who observe me and transfer me to some grammatical hyperform, while I wait with the hope that they seize me and carry me up, so that I last like an alchemist salamander in fire. It's such a sweet humor in this poem too, and I love that. You know, I mean, it's like a microcosm, macrocosm thing, right? And I love this line where I address you, I give you existence. Right? Even a name and a title in the princedom of grammar, which is the same thing. You know, you say the princedom of grammar, which connects to the Christian and Neoplatonic notion of the logos, right? Right? The princedom of grammar, of being, right? And you can see, this man lived for poetry. And not just because it was his gig, right? But because poetry does reveal, or it can, not all poetry does certainly, but both writing and reading of poetry can reveal truth to you. Because when we access the imagination, we encounter realms of truth that are not necessarily accessible by other means. I mean, this is what attracts people to the arts in general, or we're looking for something, or nature. We're looking for a hit of transcendence, because those are the things that show us that we are more than our conditions, that we are more than scientific materialism would have us think. All right, so that's it for Czesław Miłosz. Maybe one day, every once in a while I'll do one on poets. even though we live in a culture that doesn't give a damn about poetry, but that doesn't mean it's not worth giving a damn for. All right, until next time, do good things. Take care.